The Maine countryside has an untamed quality to it. There are endless forests, and no matter where you go in Maine, you are not far from water. Either the ocean, a lake, or a river. These very facts make Maine so alluring to artists, not only the wilderness, but the quality of light reflected off water, whether near or far, light unlike anywhere else. Hi, I'm Walter Smalling, the photographer for At First Light, and these are from my notes in the book. In the summer months of 2018, my partner Ray and I drove 5,000 miles in search of the artists who had come for that light. From as far south as Ogunquit, Charles Woodbury, and Falmouth, David Driscoll, to the edge of the world at Cape Split, John Marin, to the northern wilderness, William Wegman. They inhabited very different places and made homes and studios, setting up places to live and work. For if there's one thing in common among the 26 artists whose lives we recorded, it was their commitment to their art and the hard work that made them rise to the top of a very large mountain. It is not easy to become a recognizable household name in the art world, and even less common to make a comfortable living doing it. Sometimes I felt like a honeybee going from one flower to another, carrying a story, information, goodwill, even some gossip. From the dead, I searched for a story, listened to the voices from the past. From the living, I found inspiration, learned lessons, and was often just plain old entertained. Because I have often done work as a photographer in historic preservation, going to old houses belonging to artists from the past felt very familiar to me. I have a system. I go into a house and I sit down and I wait till the place speaks to me, and I hear those voices from the past. I can see what eyes had seen sometimes 100 years ago, sometimes decades, what brought people here and what inspired them. Making this book was a little bit like playing in a classical music quartet. Each musician had their own instrument and each played their own part to make the whole. We were very lucky. We had three very knowledgeable and brilliant art historians and museum professionals, Ann Collins Goodyear, Frank Goodyear, and Michael Kamenicki. And we were marking with this book the 200th anniversary of the founding of the state of Maine. On March 15th, 1820, the Missouri Compromise was signed, making it a state. We traveled around so many miles, more than 5,000, because it was very important to me what light the photographs were taken in. And so oftentimes we would go to a place 150 miles away from my hometown of Penobscot, and we would take photographs in the early dawn, and then maybe we would stay and take photographs in the evening, but I still wouldn't have what I wanted, so we would go back again. So thus, so many miles. We were going in circles around the state. We decided to start in our own backyard in Blue Hill. Jonathan Fisher arrived from Harvard in 1796 as an intern, and eventually became the minister of the Congregational Church in Blue Hill. He was a remarkable man because he could do most anything. The house that you see here, which now sits just a few, quote, city blocks from a grocery store and nearby a busy road, it looks very much like it would have when he built it, along with some help from his congregation. But Fisher could also build furniture. So everything you see in these photographs, he built by hand himself. And he often even made the tools that he made the furniture with. But he was also a very fine artist. Many of those paintings are in the collection of the Farnsworth Museum now. And he also was kept in extensive records of life at that time and made charts that were quite beautiful. One of my jobs is to tell a story that is not always there. In recreating studios, sometimes I would go to an artist studio and I'd find that it had been turned into a very comfortable Airbnb space, and consequently that didn't work for my purposes because I was trying to show what it looked like when the artist was working there. So one case in point was Charles Woodbury's studio in Ogunquit. And the owner of it, Marcia Beal Brazier, was very kind and took a great leap of faith when I asked her if we could just simply empty out the studio and start over again. There's a story that I've always liked called Stone Soup, and it's basically about soldiers who pass through a town after a war, and the townspeople are afraid that they're going to eat everything, that all the food that they have, and so they hide it all in cellars and basements. And that when the soldiers come through, they're hungry, and one of them says, does anybody have a pot and a stone? And so they bring a pot, they start a fire, they get it hot, he drops the stone in it, and after a while he takes a taste of it and says, ah, delicious, but it would be so much better if we had some carrots. So somebody goes and they bring the carrots. And then he says, ah, it would be even better with some potatoes and then some beef, and they all bring that to him. And next thing you know, they have a complete stew. And that's the way it worked with Woodbury's studio. The Woodbury boys, as we called them, who were Charles Woodbury's grandsons, remembered their grandfather's studio very well. And they told me at lunch one day that they had a lot of the things that were in his studio, from paintings to sculpture to just artifacts, things that he liked to look at. And so over the course of a couple of days, it was like stone soup. They appeared in their cars with more and more things, easels, paintings, and we put them into the space, and you get now what you see in the photograph. Sometimes it was also a matter of actually finding the artist, him or herself. The case of Marsden Hartley, which is infamous because he was a man who was very much a single man who never even really had a home. He was born in Maine, in Lewiston, and he died in Maine, in Ellsworth. And he decided late in life that he was going to come back to Maine and call himself the painter of Maine, which he succeeded in doing. And he, at the end of his life, landed up in Korea, in the Skutuk Peninsula. And this is the church that's in his famous painting of the White Church. And this was across the street from where he was renting a room. He actually had a studio in the upstairs of this church. And I discovered, in talking to a friend in my hometown who lived in Brooksville and on a farm called Bagaduce Farm. And lo and behold, it turned out, she said, that Marsden Hartley had spent several months there. He had a show at Stielitz's 291 Gallery in New York City, and it didn't do well, it didn't sell. And so he was a bit desperate, and a woman named Claire Evans, whom he knew, lived in Bagaduce Farm and invited him to come and spend time with them. She was the best friend of Georgia O'Keeffe, and here's a little sidebar that is fascinating. She was also the daughter-in-law of Mabel Dodge. So Marsden Hartley spent several months there, and he painted one of his very well-known paintings of the nephew of the Evans, who was a student at Yale, and it's of him as a swimmer sitting on the rocks there. And this is the bedroom that he slept in, and the same bed is still there, and the desk with the paint smudges on it where he worked. And of course, he's most famous for some of his images of Mount Katahdin in Baxter State Park. And so we made several trips to Baxter and hiked in to Dacey Pond in order to get some of the pictures at the same time of the year that he painted. However, the views are not really the same because the state of Maine has grown up, the tree cover, very thickly compared to what it was 100 years ago. We also went to Monhegan, again, Rockwell, Kent. This is his studio there, and this is the living room of his small house. But he also built a house for his mother, the house that Jamie Wyeth now owns. Then the Wyeths, 3 generations of the Wyeths, and they lived in several different places, but this had been the home of N.C. Wyeth until his untimely death, and it's called 8 Bells. It's in Port Clyde, and after his death, Andrew Wyeth moved with his family there, and in later years, Helga spent, of the famous paintings of Helga, spent her summers there at this house. Also, the Olson House, which is practically an icon unto itself, because one of the most famous paintings in the world is Christina's World that was painted here by Andrew Wyeth at this house. And I loved photographing this because the house still, even though the furniture is no longer there, it still feels like the old Olson homestead. And Jamie Wyeth told me that when he was a boy, when his father would go to paint, he would play there, and so knew the house very well and thought of it as almost a second home. Another place, another island where we went, and then we were traveling miles nautically, was to Great Spruce Head Island, which was the family home, summer home of Elliot Porter and Fairfield Porter. And it still is occupied by members of the Porter family, some of whom have gone to the house for the summer for their entire lifetimes. And you still cook by a wooden stove. There's almost no electricity in the house. And I was lucky enough to spend several weeks there. This is the big room in the big house, as it's known. It has 12 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms. And this is a room where the family gathered. And as you can see, it's quite spectacular. And then we moved to Lois Dodd. Lois was one of my favorite stops in the whole book. We became very good friends, and I have visited her now at her home in East Village, where a very unpretentious woman is the same in New York City as she is in Cushing, Maine, in her house. And this is her in her studio. And one of the things I loved about Lois is that when I took this picture of her bloomers on the clothesline, she was actually very amused by it, and I think liked the fact that it was in the book. Not many people would have allowed that. This is the guest room in her house, and you can see there's a lot of hand-painted surfaces, and it is truly an artist's house. There's a little sculpture in the foreground, which was made by her former husband, Bill King. Down the road from Lois's house is Bernard Langley's house. And one of the nice things about this, it's one of the places in Maine where anybody can go to see the artist and where he lived and worked. And there is an outdoor sculpture garden that you can go to at any time of the day, well, any time of the day. And this is a sort of a satirical Christina, who, as we know, was seen crawling up the lawn at the Olson house. This photograph is a portrait of Bob Indiana in his kitchen in the building on Vinyl Haven Island that was called the Star of Hope. It was a former International Order of Oddfellows building, and he told me that he bought the building in part because after he went to see it, he was told that Marsden Hartley had had a studio and had lived in the building across the street, and that sealed his purchase. He had his entire life's work in this building and had saved everything that had ever been written about him, and it was in an archives there. He also, a little sidebar, when I arrived on the island, it was late at night on a very wintry, icy night, and there in his truck was Robert Indiana waiting to pick me and my assistant up. And when I told this to someone, they said, Bob Indiana would never do that. And I said, well, he did. And we hit it off. We had a great time. We spent a week in the house and we talked at length about many things. But we also took a lot of photographs. And basically, the photographs that we took during that week are now the only surviving images of what the building looked like when Robert Indiana was still alive and working in the building. And here is the photographer again, this time in the studio of Winslow Homer in Prout's Neck in Maine. And this was an incredible privilege because what I'm looking at right here is the very window that Winslow Homer looked out of his studio at the sea, and when he watched the ocean and painted it. So here is the Ark, which was originally a stable that belonged to the Homer family. It was a few hundred feet away from this spot where it was moved, and he had it altered to be his home and his studio. And except for making trips to southern climes every year, this is where he lived out the rest of his life. And here's the way it looked before he altered it. This is him, the only known picture of him in his studio. This is the living room in the Ark on a wintry day with some snow on the ground, and this is the view that he saw if he was standing in his living room looking out at the ocean. The close of the day at Prout's Neck. And it was a great privilege to spend time there because one of the perks of being a photographer is that you can have the museum let you into the space when nobody else is there. It's a little bit like my night in the museum. One of my great privileges also was photographing David Driscoll in Falmouth. And I discovered from my sister recently something that I didn't know, and that is that my great whatever grandparents were married in 1735 in the church in Falmouth, Maine, which was then Massachusetts. The Bradburys and the Foggs married together. And so to me, it was a perfect symmetry that now I was back in Falmouth with David Driscoll, with whom I became quite good friends. And David died this summer, which is a great loss. He was an incredible educator and artist. And here he built a house that I said when I first saw it, I said, David, you're from Georgia, and what you've done is you've recreated a holler in Georgia here in Falmouth, Maine. And this was his house up in the trees. And then his studio here is one he made himself. He built both of them. And he made this from leftover parts from a lot of different places. When we toured the gardens, he told me that he brought seeds and trees from everywhere he traveled, from important people and important places, and he called them memory trees when he planted them in his own garden in Maine. Also, one of the great pleasures of doing this book was meeting and spending time with Ashley Bryan. Ashley turned 97 this year, and he lives and has lived for several decades alone in a house on Little Cranberry Island. And when we spent the day with him, I said that the inside of the house reminded me of what the inside of Ashley's brain probably was. It was wonderful that all of the different things that he has collected and the place where he makes his art, which is not only graphic art, but also stained glass windows and other objects, dolls. And he did a series on reinventing the lives of slaves and what might have happened to them had it not gone the way it did. But here is Ashley with his great nephew, and it was a great privilege spending time with him on Little Cranberry. This now is Molly Neptune Parker, who is probably the preeminent Native American basket maker, certainly in North America. And unfortunately, very tragically, we lost Molly this summer also. But it was amazing to me because she lived such a simple life. The days we were there visiting her, she had a constant flow of visitors, and I was aware of somebody who was not only a leader in her craft and in her art, but also in the Passamaquoddy tribe of which she was a member and a leader. And all day long, family and friends came to see her and seek counsel. And we watched her making a basket, and I was surprised by my partner Ray a couple of months later when he had secretly made plans with Molly to send me a birthday present of one of her baskets, which looks very much like this one on the left, one of her signature flower baskets. Another one of the really fun times that we had during this more than 5,000 mile odyssey was visiting William Wegman and his wife Christina. Bill had found an old inn in the Rangeley Lake area and had bought it years ago along with several of the cabins and buildings on the property. And he uses this as his summer home and as his studio. And we stayed there actually with them in one of the cabins. And Flo and Topper, two of the Weimaraners in a long line of dogs over the years, were there present. And it was a beautiful space and a lot of fun to be there. The Wegmans were extremely nice and gracious hosts. And one of the things that I'll always love Bill Wegman for was when I was there taking these photographs, I had a leg injury. and I was running behind him trying to get a photograph that I knew would be a good one, but I wasn't fast enough and I missed it. And at one point he figured out what was happening and he turned around to me and said, "Anything we do, Walter, we can do again." And I became a lifelong fan. But here's the living room of the lodge. You can see the dogs and Bill outside the door. And here is also the costume room where there were probably maybe almost thousands of dresses and coats and clothes that he cut holes in the arms so that the dogs could be standing inside the clothes and he could have human hands come around the dogs. And everyone who knows Wegman's photographs knows the way in which he did that. And here is one of the dogs looking out at the lake. And here's my photograph of the lake, our last day there. This is my portrait of Richard Tuttle. When we arrived at his property on Mount Desert Island, I was astonished because I thought there was nothing there. Eventually, walking around, I realized that there were several temporary looking buildings. Actually, this here is the bedroom that was hanging over the cliff on the edge of the beach, and actually a big storm would have taken it out. It was on stilts, and the same was true with all of the buildings, and there was an outdoor shower. Richard and I spent several hours walking the beaches and the property, and he explained to me that his studio was the land, and that's where he got inspiration and also where he often worked and used the things from that land. There are many other artists in the book, but Maine became a force for American art. And many artists would come to Maine, spend the summer, and then go back to New York or wherever and extol the virtues of this beautiful place, this wild country with incredible light and a lot of things to paint. And eventually they came in such numbers that there were colonies and there were schools in Maine. But over the course of 200 years, it was really always one theme that brought them all together. They came and they saw this incredible light, and it inspired all of them. It was always the light.